keyboard. So this is the Boog75, which is a fantastic name. So a big thanks first off to Millitrix for actually sending this my way so that I could take a look at it. But this is actually based sort of on a keyboard that they currently have, which is called the Zoom75. And the Zoom75 is a well-loved 75% layout keyboard with a really nice metal case. It's actually aluminum. However, this is a little bit special because this guy is actually using, man, this is heavy, it's actually using Hall effect magnetic sensors instead of traditional mechanical switches. And that allows for some really neat stuff. But first off, how does it actually look and what does it come with? Well, inside this case we have the requisite cable, which by the way is one of those really nice coiled cables, which is always good for saving up your desk space and stuff. Makes sense for a 75% keyboard especially. It's kind of the point. And you've got some basic tools and things here just to help you work on the case if you need it, but the board itself comes in this nice little bag and is very heavy. So this board actually weighs about 3 kilos or 6.6 pounds roughly. So this is also like a home defense weapon. It's a very heavy keyboard, but that's because this is an aluminum case and everything about it feels very premium as a result of it being this nice metal sort of finish on everything. And how does it feel and sound? Well, first impressions, it's different than I expected because it's very, very smooth. I was expecting it to feel like a linear switch, like something like a Cherry MX Red or a Gateron Pro Yellow. These are actually Gateron switches, but they're, like I said, Hall effect switches rather than mechanical ones. You've got your main port right there. And if you're curious about his 75% layout, because it's not the most common layout out there, a lot of manufacturers go from 10 keyless straight to 65%. 75% is right in the middle, and it is kind of like a 65, but you've got a function row. You know, on a 65%, this would be cut off, and you would have the number row as the top of the board. And instead of the 10 keyless cluster over here, the sort of navigation cluster, you have this line that is a thinner sort of single spaced line instead of 3. So it's right in the middle.
So yeah, the real heart of this keyboard are the Gateron KS37B switches. So what exactly makes them special? Well, to put it simply, your usual keyboard switch is a digital input, right? It's either on or it's off. You're either pressing it or you're not. There aren't really degrees of pressing a keyboard key. However, with Hall effect switches, they are a magnet over a sensor, and the sensor does precisely measure the distance to the magnet, which means rather than either being on or off, it's actually a selection of distances closer to something like an analog input, like an analog stick. And this creates some really neat use cases. So this means that this keyboard is actually almost closer to an analog input than it is a digital one. I don't know if it's technically considered an analog input because it's not on an axis like an analog stick is, but it is a similar idea. And one of the first really useful advantages of this type of design is the fact that the software allows you to customize the actuation distance of every single key individually. Normally, when you have a key switch on a keyboard, it has a set actuation distance and it's determined by the switch. So whatever kind of switch you have a specific distance that you have to press it down in order for it to activate. But with this, you can actually customize that distance and set it to whatever you want in very precise increments of 1/10 of a millimeter. So you can customize every single key individually to actuate to be considered a press at the exact distance you want. So for instance, for me, I have my spacebar to be a little bit less sensitive because I don't want it to accidentally go off when I'm just laying my thumb on it. I want to actually have to kind of slam it down, you know, for like a jump or whatever. But my escape key, I have set to a much lesser distance because I tend to kind of reach up my fingers quickly and just sort of graze across it, and it doesn't necessarily press down super hard every time. So I want it to have kind of a lower activation distance so that I can just quickly reach my fingers up and press it without having to really significantly move my whole hand. So this means you can really customize the feel of the keyboard to exactly what you want by making sure every single key has the feel that you want. And this is a really big advantage over a normal mechanical switch, because being able to customize the exact feel of your board and how much you need to press for every key is a pretty cool bit of user customization that I could definitely get used to. Another really cool advantage is this means you can actually set multiple functions per key depending on how far you press it. In fact, the board actually supports up to 4 functions per key, which is pretty crazy. So if you want to, say, just barely glide across a key and have it type a lowercase letter, but bottom it out really hard and have it automatically switch to an uppercase letter, you can do that if you'd like. This is really cool because it brings us a lot closer to that old dream, which is, people always say, well, a mouse is so much better than a controller for FPS and stuff, but an analog stick is so much better for movement than a keyboard because a keyboard is purely digital. So if we could have an analog keyboard, then we could have the best of both worlds. Well, this is basically that, or at least it's getting us a lot closer to that. So the ability to vary pressure per key is actually possible now. But there's also one other small advantage of this design that I never thought about until I actually used it, which is the reset distance. So if you're used to playing games that have inputs such as you gotta mash a key like a QuickTime event or something like that, hit E a whole bunch of times real fast, well, you know that a keyboard isn't always as good as a controller for that, because a controller's buttons has very small amounts of travel, so it resets super quickly. But when you're pressing a keyboard key, you've got to make sure to lift your finger up enough to where the mechanical switch actually physically resets and can accept another press. If you don't lift your finger up enough before you press it again, then that press won't do anything. So if you're used to playing games like this with a keyboard, then you'll know that sometimes when you're forced to mash a key, some of your mashes won't actually register because you just haven't lifted your finger up enough each time in order to press it down again. However, that problem is completely gone with this keyboard because the magnetic sensor detects whether or not the magnet is traveling downwards a specific distance, not necessarily whether it's traveled up enough to reset, because there is no reset necessarily, because there's no physical switch to reset. It's a pure magnet. So this means that if you mash a key with this keyboard, it actually detects each press as a mash regardless of how far you let the key reset. If you have it set to travel 1 millimeter for a press, then as long as you press it down 1 millimeter, it will detect as a press, even if you haven't lifted it back up all the way yet. So this means that QuickTime events and stuff with this keyboard work a lot smoother because pretty much every single press will actually register rather than having about half of them not register because you didn't reset the key enough. So that's just a small little advantage that I really appreciate with a design like this, because it shows how different this concept is from a traditional digital switch. In terms of sound profile, as you heard earlier, this is a very quiet keyboard. The switches do come pre-lubed from the factory, so they're very, very smooth and quite quiet. And even when you bottom a switch out entirely, it's still pretty quiet. If you've used something like a Cherry MX Silent switch, like a Silent Silver, then you'll probably know what I'm talking about in terms of just the only sounds you hear really are just the edges of the keycap hitting against the gasket of the board. So it's a super quiet keyboard, and when you're actually, going at it and typing a whole bunch or something, it has this sort of pleasant, bassy, crackly sound to it. It actually kind of reminds me of like hearing someone pop their knuckles in the other room. It's kind of what it sounds like to me. It's got this like low poppy kind of sound to it that isn't a super sharp click or clack. It's more like a thunk. So you've got this low, quiet thunking happening in the other room, and it makes for a really pleasant keyboard to use. And in fact, I looked for some excuses just to send a whole bunch of emails and stuff just so that I'd have a bunch of stuff to type quickly when I first unboxed this keyboard and wanted to try it out. And it's a real joy to use. It feels so smooth and nice. And the feedback towards your fingers, the actual feel that you get if you bottom one out, is quite soft and pleasant, but still sharp enough to be definite, as in it's not squishy. This is not a board that feels squishy at all, despite how quiet it is. Because I know that is a problem that some people have with certain very quiet keyboards that use a lot of like gasket foam and stuff. They're a little bit squishy. They have a sort of a small travel, and then when they actually hit the bottom, they kind of squish inwards slowly. This does not do that. In terms of its game response, it's mega fast, which is kind of part of the reason that all of the keyboards that currently use these magnetic switches are advertised as gaming keyboards. It's because these Hall effect switches have an ultra fast response time, so just typing anything is really nice, but actually playing something, you get to feel that there's extremely little latency and all of the keys are highly responsive. This is probably the most responsive keyboard I've ever felt, honestly, when it comes to game response. Just moving around WASD feels really responsive in everything, and if you're playing something with really fast movement like an FPS, something like, I don't know, Turbo Overkill or Ultra Kill or something where you're going to be needing to use the movement keys in really quick succession, as well as stuff like jumping and sliding and things like that, so that you've got to be really dancing across the keys with your left hand, you'll feel, it just feels a little bit different than a traditional mechanical keyboard. It just feels a little bit more responsive, a little bit faster, and really clear and clean with its inputs. Probably because you can individually customize every input to have to press it down exactly as much as you want, so this means that you always kind of feel in control, I guess you could say. That's probably why they're advertised for gaming so heavily, is because of this really low response time and high responsiveness in general. It means that the keys just feel good to use in a game, and that translation from pressing a key to action on screen is just so rapid and so clear that it feels really good to use. You get that immediate feeling of, I press a key and then thing happens like instantaneously because there's so little latency. In terms of the layout, I'll admit that it has taken me a little bit of getting used to not having a numpad. I'm used to using it all the time because, of course, I do video editing and stuff, so I do actually use the numpad pretty often. But more important to me than the numpad is the function row, so I needed the F keys. And in fact, this keyboard actually has an F13, which is pretty rare to find, but it is there. And yeah, so I'd much rather have the function row than I would have a numpad if I had to get rid of one for a layout. And I'm actually really enjoying this layout. It's nice to have some extra room on my desk for my mouse, because I tend to use a relatively low sensitivity in FPS and stuff, so I want to move my mouse around quite a lot, so having the extra space is nice. So I have been able to successfully get used to the 75% layout, and I actually quite enjoy it. I also really like the little babby shift key on the right. I think that's sort of cute. And of course, as for fit and finish, this is a very good feeling keyboard. It's all metal. It's in an aluminum case, so it's very heavy, but it's also super sturdy and solid feeling and sounding. The keycaps do feel of quite high quality and are of course replaceable, even though this board is not hot swappable because that's just not how the PCB that uses these Hall effect sensors works. You can still swap the keycaps because they are the sort of plus-shaped cherry type keycaps. But I do appreciate how much of an absolute unit this keyboard actually feels like, because it's just such a solid slab of metal, and it looks really nice as well. It's got a nice color scheme and legend for the keys, although of course that is very much personal preference, and there are currently 2 colorways available for this particular board. Overall, after having used it for a little bit now, this has become my favorite keyboard that I own. It just feels so good to use. It's got such a unique sound and feel to its switches, and I really like the tech behind its switches and want to support more Hall effect peripherals, because honestly I think Hall effect is kind of the future of gaming peripherals, and I would like to see it proliferate further. I think that this is an excellent keyboard for its price and could probably be priced higher and people would still buy it, because when you're talking about highly specialized handmade boards like this, they can easily go in like the $400+ range in some cases, but this is half that, and I think it's a very fair price for an extremely high quality board with some switches that I think are things that people need to get on board with, because they're super cool to use, and what they represent and what they're capable of could mean some really interesting stuff in the future for PC gaming in general. So for me, this board is a pure 10 out of 10. It's just an absolute joy to use, and I'm more than pleased to upgrade my setup by actually having it as my new daily driver. So I'll put the links in the description below this video to the main website for this board, so that you can go and check it out yourselves. And just know that there are several different retailers that you can actually purchase this board from. So depending on where you're located and what the tax rates are and stuff like that, you may be able to find a better deal on different websites. So feel free to look around at their different suppliers. And yeah, so check the description for all that stuff and check it out yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching. And of course, thanks again to Mellotrix for actually providing this for me so that I could actually take a look at it. And I'll see you guys next time.